At 12 hours and 17 minutes on August 31st, 1997, a Mercedes-Benz S280 entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris at a speed of between 118 and 155 kilometers per hour, in a zone with a legal limit of 50 kilometers per hour. The car, driven by Henri Paul, acting head of security at the Hotel Ritz, was carrying 4 people. In the rear left seat sat the most famous and most hounded woman on the planet, Diana, Princess of Wales, 36 years old, mother of Princes William and Henry of England, ex-wife of the heir to the British throne. To her right sat the man with whom she had been appearing on every front page in the world for weeks, Ahmad el-Din Mohamed Al-Fayed, universally known as Dodi, 42 years old, businessman, film producer, son of the billionaire owner of Harrods. In the front passenger seat sat bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones. Within seconds of entering the tunnel, the car lost control. It struck the 13th pillar of the underpass. Dodi Fayed and Henri Paul died on impact. Diana, Princess of Wales, was transferred to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where she died at 4 in the morning. Trevor Rees-Jones was the only survivor. Before dawn, on that August 31st, 1997, the world had changed. But the story that would be told during the weeks, months, years, and decades that followed would be primarily the story of Diana. The man who died with her, the man sitting to her right in that car, the man whose father spent the rest of his life insisting that both had been murdered, is the figure this script places at the center of his own story. This is the story of Dodi Fayed, which did not begin in the ALMA tunnel, and which deserved a different ending than the one it had. Ahmad el-Din Mohamed Abdelmonem Fayed was born on April 15, 1955, in Alexandria, Egypt. His father was a man who had risen from practically nothing to become one of the wealthiest businessmen in the world, and his mother was Samira Khashoggi, a Saudi writer and sister of arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi. Through his mother's side, Dodi was a first cousin of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who would be murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018 in a crime that shocked the world. The family surrounding Dodi Fayed from birth was not exactly the kind that produces quiet lives. It was a network of enormous money, limitless ambition, connections in the darkest circles of international power, and a capacity for scandal that its most prominent members exercised with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Mohamed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, deserves his own analysis, because it is impossible to understand Dodi's life without understanding the shadow his father cast over it. Mohamed was born in Alexandria in 1929, the son of a school inspector, with no inherited money and an ambition that his biographers describe as boundless from adolescence. He built his fortune through a combination of hard work, audacity, strategic marriage alliances, and a willingness to operate at the margins of what the international business world considers acceptable, something his critics documented extensively and that he always denied. He arrived in London in the 1960s and spent the following decades building the empire that would include Harrods department store, the Paris Ritz, Fulham Football Club, and properties across Europe. He applied for British citizenship and was repeatedly denied, which he interpreted as racial discrimination and which his enemies described as the consequence of investigations into his business record. He was one of the richest men in the world, and also, according to the Metropolitan Police investigators who questioned him decades later, one of the most frequently reported subjects of sexual assault complaints from female employees. He died on August 30th, 2023, at 94, one day before the anniversary of Dodi and Diana's deaths. The story of Mohamed Al-Fayed and his relationship with the British establishment is one of the most revealing about the paradoxes of power and money in Britain in the final quarter of the 20th century. Mohamed arrived in London in the 1960s without British citizenship and without the network of contacts that the British upper class builds over generations through the same schools and institutions. What he had was money, ambition, and a will to gain access to the circles of power that his critics described as obsessive. The purchase of Harrods in 1985, for which he paid approximately £600 million to the Lonhro Group in a transaction that generated years of legal controversy, was the move that installed him definitively in British public life. Harrods was not just a shop, it was a symbol of British class and taste that no Egyptian immigrant without citizenship had ever owned. It was also proof that Mohamed Al-Fayed could buy what the system said belonged to other people, the Department of Trade. Investigation that followed the Harrods acquisition, initiated by businessman Tiny Rowland, who felt deceived in the transaction, cast doubt on the true origins of Mohammed's fortune and the accuracy of some of his prior declarations about his wealth. The report was critical. Mohammed denied everything and pressed on. It was the pattern that would define his relationship with British institutions for decades. The accusation, the denial, the continuation, as if the accusation had never occurred. He applied for British citizenship in 1993. He was refused. Tony Blair's Labour government, which came to power in 1997, also declined to grant it. France, by contrast, awarded him the Légion d'honneur. Mohamed Al-Fayed consistently interpreted every refusal as racism and as the price of being an Arab Egyptian who had dared to go too far in a society that had not invited him. Dodi grew up in that world of unlimited money and the specific pressure of being the firstborn son of a man who has achieved everything on his own. His parents divorced when he was 4, and Dodi remained in his father's custody, who later married Finnish model Heini Waten and had 4 more children with her. Dodi studied at the Collège Saint-Marc in Alexandria and then at the Institut Le Rosey in Switzerland, one of the most exclusive and most expensive boarding schools in the world, where the international aristocracy and plutocracy send their children to learn everything they need to know about moving in the circles they will inhabit. At 19, he enrolled at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in Britain, the same institution that would later train Princes William and Harry. He served as an attaché at the UAE Embassy in London. But what Dodi was passionate about was not the military nor business in the conventional sense. It was films. According to his father, who said so in a 2003 interview with Variety magazine, Dodi had been in love with cinema since childhood. And in 1980, with his father's financial backing, Dodi founded Allied Stars Limited, a film production company through which he attempted to build a career in Hollywood that was genuinely his own, independent of the surname that opened every door. Allied Stars' second project was a success that no one anticipated at the scale it achieved. Chariots of Fire, the British sports drama directed by Hugh Hudson, telling the story of Jewish athlete Harold Abrahams and his path to the gold medal in the 100 meters at the 1924 Paris Olympics, was a co-production between Dodi Fayed and David Putnam. The film received 7 nominations at the 1982 Academy Awards ceremony. It won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture. When Putnam took the stage to accept the Best Picture Oscar, he said something that defined that moment for Dodi Fayed. To Mohamed and Dodi Fayed, who were there when we needed them and put their money where I put my words. It was the most important public acknowledgement Dodi had ever received. It was proof that he could accomplish something in his own name, even if that name carried his father's fortune built into it. But the Hollywood career that the Chariots of Fire Oscar promised was not exactly what followed. David Putnam, the co-producer who had accepted the award, revealed years later that he had removed Dodi from the production for allegedly distributing cocaine among the crew. It was the first time someone in the industry had publicly raised something that those who knew him were aware of, but that was rarely said out loud, that Dodi Fayed, with all the money in the world and the best possible start in the film industry, had difficulty building a coherent professional career because his priorities were not exactly what a coherent professional career requires. An anonymous collaborator who worked with him described it with a bluntness that in the years following his death would have been impossible to publish. Dodi was a charming guy, but he knew as much about producing films as my cleaning lady. He'd show up with the money and take the title, but I don't know if he ever did the day-to-day work. What Dodi did consistently was produce films with his father's money throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. He produced FX in 1986, FX2 in 1991, and served as executive producer on Hook in 1991. Steven Spielberg's film with Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman, which, though not the strongest entry in Spielberg's career, was a major cultural event. But Dodi's life outside of work was equally prominent and far more extensively documented. He was a frequent presence in the best nightclubs in Los Angeles, New York, and London. He was known as someone who lived with the specific generosity of those who have unlimited money and the need to demonstrate that they have it. He was the kind of figure that attracts certain circles of admiration and also certain types of friendships that last exactly as long as proximity to someone who picks up the tab. His only formal marriage was to model Suzanne Gregard, lasting approximately 8 months in 1987 and ending in divorce. It was the kind of marriage that biographers describe with the vocabulary of impulsiveness. Quick to begin, equally quick to end. Dodi was not a man who appeared in the society pages as someone building lasting relationships. He was someone who appeared with beautiful women in the most visible places in the world, with the regularity of someone for whom that kind of visibility was part of the air he breathed. The film world of the 1980s, in which Dodi tried to establish himself, had clear hierarchies that money could penetrate, but that money alone could not guarantee respect within. Hollywood had its own membership rules. You had to have worked your way up from below, had to know the industry's language, had to have proven you could read a script and recognize whether it was good before anyone told you it was. Dodi arrived with the wrong name for those kinds of credentials. He was not the prodigy who had made student short films in New York. He was the son of the owner of Harrods, who put his father's money into projects and then converted them into business cards for the award circuit parties. The Chariots of Fire Oscar was real and was deserved in the sense that allied stars made a financial contribution to an extraordinary film. But the dynamic of that contribution, money as a tool for accessing others' creativity, remained the template of Dodi's career. The films he produced afterward, F/X, and its sequel, Hook, had their own merits, but Dodi Fayed's career contained no evidence of a producer who had developed his own artistic vision or generated projects from scratch. What it contained was someone who found good projects, put money into them, and was lucky enough for some of those projects to turn out well. It was a producer's career in the most literal sense of the word, without the creative component that distinguishes great producers from executives with a checkbook. Dodi Fayed's social life in Los Angeles during the 1980s and 1990s is documented in the society pages and in the testimonies of journalists and industry collaborators. He was the kind of presence that money and glamour produce when they coincide in a single person. Always well-dressed, always in the right place, always with the right people around him, always willing to pick up the bill. He was a man who, according to those who knew him, had genuine charm. Not the manufactured charm of someone who has learned to simulate it, but the natural charm of someone who sincerely enjoyed other people's company and made those around him feel good. He was also, according to those same testimonies, someone who never quite resolved the question of who he was when no one was watching. The story of Dodi Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales, officially began in the summer of 1997, but has a prehistory worth telling. The two first met in the second half of the 1980s at a polo match at Windsor Castle. Diana was still married to Prince Charles, and Dodi was accompanying his father to the event because Mohamed Al-Fayed was one of the tournament's sponsors. It was the kind of encounter that the circles of aristocracy and international money produce when the worlds of real power and financial power touch at the sporting events both frequent. It was not a moment of particular significance for either of them. It could not have been, because Diana was the wife of the heir to the British throne, and Dodi was an Egyptian film producer whom no one in those circles would have considered a relevant candidate for the Princess of Wales's future. 10 years later, everything had changed. Diana had been divorced since 1996. Her divorce from Prince Charles had been one of the biggest media events of the second half of the 20th century, preceded by years of speculation, leaks, the famous 1995 BBC interview with Martin Bashir, in which Diana spoke about her depression, her bulimia, and Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, with the honesty no member of the royal family had ever shown on television. She was free in the legal sense, but she was still the most hounded person in the world by the media. The paparazzi who had documented her married life for 15 years had not reduced their interest in her after the divorce. If anything, they had intensified it, because the divorced Diana was potentially more interesting than the married Diana. She might have a love life to photograph. In the summer of 1997, Mohamed Al-Fayed invited Diana and her sons to spend a few days aboard his yacht in Saint-Tropez. It was the kind of gesture that Dodi's father had learned to make over decades of building connections with the most important people in the world. The Egyptian businessman, who never obtained the British citizenship he wanted, had instead access to the most illustrious family of the empire, and could arrange Riviera holidays for their children. Princes William and Harry spent days on the Al-Fayed family yacht. Dodi, who at that point had been in a relationship with American model Kelly Fisher, and who according to Fisher was engaged to her, also appeared. Kelly Fisher is a chapter that the romantic narrative of the Diana and Dodi story tends to omit or minimize, but one that deserves its own attention. Fisher and Dodi had been together for approximately 2 years when the summer of 1997 brought them to the French Riviera. According to Fisher's testimony, she held a press conference in August 1997 with attorney Gloria Allred, displaying a diamond and sapphire ring she presented as the engagement ring Dodi had given her. The relationship was formal and the engagement was real. According to Dodi's representatives, he had made no promise of marriage. According to the available facts, Dodi ended his relationship with Fisher on August 7, 1997, by telephone, 3 days after photographs of him kissing Diana on the Jonical yacht were published by the British tabloid Sunday Mirror. Those photographs of the kiss between Diana and Dodi, taken on the family yacht on August 4, 1997, were bought by tabloids for sums that represented records at the time. It was the image the world had been waiting weeks for, since the first reports of the Mediterranean holiday had begun to circulate. It was visual confirmation that Diana, the world's most famous princess, had a new love story. And it was also the beginning of the period in which the media pursuit of the couple reached an intensity that neither of them could have fully anticipated. Though Diana, who had lived under paparazzi siege for 15 years, was the most aware person on the planet of what that kind of attention could produce. Dodi, for his part, was someone who had spent his adult life in the circles where the famous and the photographers who document them are two parts of the same system. He had attended film premieres and industry screenings. He had appeared in society magazines. But the scale of the attention generated by his relationship with Diana was something qualitatively different from anything he had previously experienced. It was not the attention a film producer generates at industry events. It was the attention of 200 million people who bought the magazines that published Diana's photographs. It was the attention of paparazzi willing to cross any legal and ethical line to get the image that would be worth tens of thousands of pounds on the European and American tabloid market. The weeks of August 1997 were those of an intense romance, documented by the lenses of hundreds of photographers who followed the couple across the Mediterranean. Dodi and Diana spent time on the Jonical, in Saint-Tropez, in Sardinia, in Portofino. Images of the two together, laughing, tanned, relaxed, circulated across every front page in the world. During that same period, Dodi visited the Repossi, jewelers in Monaco, according to the testimony of owner Alberto Repossi, who years later spoke to the Italian press about that encounter. Diana had pointed, from outside the boutique, to a ring from the collection called Dis-moi. Oui, say yes to me. Repossi arranged an appointment in Saint-Tropez to discuss the ring. The question of whether Dodi proposed to Diana in the hours before their deaths is one that subsequent investigations could not answer with certainty, because the only people who could have answered it died that night. Dodi's father insisted for years that he had, and that Diana had accepted. Diana's circle, including her former butler Paul Burrell, questioned that version. Dodi's friends described someone deeply in love and ready to commit. His critics pointed out that he had been with Diana for only weeks, and that the apparent speed of the supposed engagement was more consistent with his impulsive character than with someone who had made a considered decision. The official 2008 inquest found insufficient evidence to either confirm or deny that a marriage proposal had been made. Diana's life after her 1996 divorce was that of someone who had recovered the formal freedom to make her own choices, but who was discovering that freedom was more complicated to exercise than she had imagined. She was still the mother of the heirs to the British throne. She was still the most photographed woman in the world. Her movements were still the subject of permanent speculation in the press. Her humanitarian work, which was genuine and which included her campaign against landmines that would take her to Angola and Bosnia in the months before her death, gave her purpose and visibility. But her personal life was the object of the attention of millions of people who could not resist the question of who the world's most famous princess would be with now. Her most serious previous relationship before meeting Dodi that summer had been with Pakistani cardiac surgeon Hasnat Khan, with whom she had maintained a relationship of several years in the greatest possible discretion. The discretion was the mechanism protecting the relationship. Khan did not want the public attention that inevitably accompanied any man who was with Diana, and Diana understood that the only way to keep something real was to keep it invisible. The relationship ended at some point in 1997, shortly before the Mediterranean holidays began. Some of Diana's biographers, including former butler Paul Burrell, suggested that the summer with Dodi was in part a response to the end of the relationship with Khan, an attempt to find something to fill the space the relationship had left. What is known with certainty is what happened on August 30th, 1997. Dodi and Diana arrived by private jet in Paris from Sardinia, where they had continued their Mediterranean holiday. That afternoon, they went to see the apartment that had belonged to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on the Boulevard du Bois de Boulogne, an apartment Mohamed Al-Fayed had purchased and furnished with original Windsor pieces. According to some accounts, Dodi wanted Diana to see it as a possible future residence. They then stopped at Repossi Jewelers, where the ring they had ordered weeks earlier was collected. That evening, they went to dine at the restaurant Chez Benoit, but the presence of paparazzi posted at the entrance made them change plans. They returned to the Ritz. They attempted to dine in the hotel restaurant, but the attention of other guests made the dinner uncomfortable. Dodi arranged for dinner to be served in the Imperial Suite. They finished eating around midnight. What happened then was the result of decisions made in the final minutes of Dodi Fayed's life. The original plan to return to Dodi's apartment on the Rue Arsène Housset was to use the main car with a chauffeur and bodyguard, with a decoy car leaving by the main entrance to distract the photographers who had been posted in front of the Ritz for hours. It was a tactic they had used at other times during the preceding weeks. Henri Paul, who had been off duty that evening and was called back to the hotel, was the one who drove the car. Henri Paul was 41 years old, had worked at the Ritz for 11 years, and had become head of security at the establishment. He was a man trusted by the Al-Fayed family. The toxicological test carried out after the accident revealed that Henri Paul had consumed significant quantities of alcohol that evening. A blood level of between 1.73 and 1.87 grams per litre, more than 3 times the legal driving limit in France. In addition to alcohol, he had in his system a combination of medications, Prozac, Noctamid, Tiapride, and acamprosate, all of them incompatible with driving and with alcohol consumption, according to their own package inserts. He was a man with a known alcohol dependency, who was taking medications to manage it, who had drunk anyway that night, and who was put behind the wheel of a car carrying one of the most famous people in the world and her companion. The Mercedes S280 left the Ritz by the rear entrance on the Rue Cambon at 12:20 in the morning. It had 4 occupants: Henri Paul, Trevor Rees-Jones in the front passenger seat, Dodi and Diana in the rear. None of the 4 was wearing a seatbelt, a detail that subsequent investigations would identify as one of the factors that made the accident fatal. From the first moment, the car was followed by several vehicles carrying photographers. Henri Paul accelerated. The route went along the Avenue Cambon, the Place de la Concorde, the Cours la Reine, and Avenue Albert I, heading toward the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. When the Mercedes entered the tunnel, witnesses in the vicinity described a car traveling at speeds far above those permitted. At 12 hours and 23 minutes, the car struck the 13th pillar. Trevor Rees-Jones survived. His seatbelt was not fastened, but his body position in the front seat and the airbag that deployed saved his life, though he suffered multiple facial bone fractures, requiring months of reconstructive surgery. He lost his memories of the moments immediately before the accident and was never able to provide a complete account of what occurred inside the car in those final seconds. Dr. Frédéric Maillier, who happened to be passing through the tunnel on his way home from a party when the accident occurred, was the first medically qualified person to attend to the injured. He began with Diana, who was unconscious on the floor of the destroyed vehicle. He called the emergency services. When the firefighters and paramedics arrived, Méliès did not know who the woman he had attended was. They only found out upon arriving at the hospital. Méliès said years later that that night had marked him for life, that every time he drove through the ALMA tunnel, he asked himself if he had done everything he could, that the shock of learning afterward who the woman he had tried to save was never left him. Diana was transferred to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. Doctors worked for hours to stabilize her. She had a massive pulmonary contusion of the left lung and a hemorrhage in the pericardial cavity, the sac surrounding the heart. Blood pressure dropped in a way they could not sustain. At 4 a.m. of August 31st, 1997, Diana Frances Spencer, Princess of Wales, was declared dead. She was 36 years old. Dodi Fayed and Henry Paul had died on impact. Within hours, the entire world would know what had happened in that tunnel, and the period of mourning that followed was of a magnitude that no event in the recent history of the United Kingdom had produced in peacetime. The investigations that followed the accident were two. A French one, led by Judge Hervé Stéphan, which concluded in 1999, attributing the accident exclusively to Henri Paul, whose driving at excessive speed, was the direct cause of the crash. And a British one, Operation Paget, initiated in 2004 by the Metropolitan Police at the request of the Royal Coroner, which investigated with a team of 14 officers for almost 3 years and published its report in December 2006. Its more than 800 pages examined every conspiracy theory that had arisen since the accident: MI6 involvement, royal family intervention, a mysterious car, alleged manipulation of Henri Paul's blood tests, Diana's supposed pregnancy. The report concluded that there was no evidence supporting any of the conspiracy theories, and that all indications pointed to the deaths of Diana and Dodi being the result of a tragic accident. The definitive judicial inquest opened in October 2007 under Lord Justice Scott Baker and concluded on April 7, 2008, with the jury's verdict. The jury found that Diana and Dodi had been unlawfully killed through grossly negligent driving by Henri Paul and by the paparazzi pursuing the vehicle, with additional contributing factors being the driver's impaired judgment from alcohol and the fact that none of the occupants was wearing a seatbelt. There was no plot. There was no conspiracy. Judge Baker said in his summary to the jury that there was not a shred of evidence that the princess's death had been ordered by Prince Philip or carried out by the security services. The day after the verdict, Mohamed Al-Fayed announced he was bringing his 10-year campaign to prove the death had been a murder to an end, saying he did so for the sake of Diana's children. Mohamed Al-Fayed erected 2 monuments to Dodi and Diana in Harrods, one in 1998 and a larger one in 2005. In the second, there is a photograph of the two together and an urn supposedly containing a bottle of wine from the dinner that night and the engagement ring Dodi had purchased at Riposi. They are the memorial of a father who never fully accepted the official verdicts, who spent decades and millions of pounds trying to make the world believe his son had been killed, and who died on August 30th, 2023, exactly 26 years after the last night of Dodi's life, one day before the anniversary of the deaths. He was the kind of coincidence that in other circumstances might have been read as poetic. In the circumstances of Mohamed Al-Fayed, who in the years before his death was the subject of Metropolitan Police investigations into more than 140 sexual assault complaints from female employees, the coincidence carries a different flavour. The posthumous story of Mohamed Al-Fayed adds another layer to Dodi's story because it illuminates the family environment in which Dodi grew up. The sexual assault complaints against Mohamed, which his victims described in testimony gathered by the BBC and Scotland Yard, dated back decades and had been ignored or silenced for years by the same combination of power and money Mohamed had used for everything else. Harrods, under its new Qatari ownership, offered compensation of up to £385,000 to victims and issued a formal apology. The Metropolitan Police acknowledged that it had received the first complaint against Mohamed as early as 1995 and had not acted. It was the image of a system that had protected a powerful man from the consequences of his actions for decades, and that only processed the facts after the man was dead. The story of Dodi Fayed is also the story of a specific kind of life of the 20th century. The son of a man who built everything from nothing, who grows up in the shadow of a fortune he did not earn, who tries to build something of his own and partly succeeds, but never quite completely, who lives with the generosity and velocity of someone who knows that money is not the problem, but suspects it is not the solution either. He was 42 years old when he died. He had produced an Oscar-winning film. He had lived in the best hotels and the best yachts in the world. And in the last weeks of his life, he had been with one of the most extraordinary women of the century, pursued by hundreds of photographers who wanted to document his story. The night of August 30th to 31st, 1997, at the Paris Ritz contains in its details the full tragedy of what follows. The hotel, property of Mohamed Al-Fayed since 1979, was one of the most secure places Dodi and Diana could have been in Paris in terms of access control. Paparazzi could not enter. The hotel's security was professional and discreet. Dodi and Diana had spent hours in the Imperial Suite, with the dinner served upstairs to avoid exposure in the restaurant, probably with the conversation only they could know how it went. And at some point in the night, they made the decision to leave for Dodi's apartment, about 3 kilometers away, rather than staying in the hotel or returning to it later. The decision to call Henri Paul to drive that car has been analysed from every possible angle. Did anyone know the state Henri Paul was in that night? Investigations found no evidence that anyone at the Ritz had concrete information about his alcohol level. Henri Paul had spent the afternoon off duty, had been drinking at a nearby bar, and when called back to the hotel, appeared without anyone apparently noticing or acting on what was clear to investigators who came later. It was the kind of systemic failure that produces tragedies, not an act of malice, but a set of individual decisions, none of which seemed catastrophic at the moment it was made. The decoy car plan, with a vehicle leaving by the main entrance with bodyguards to distract the photographers, while Henri Paul's Mercedes left by the rear, was the same type of tactic they had used during the preceding weeks. The difference that night was the concentration of paparazzi who had been posted in front of the hotel for hours and had organized a far more systematic operation than on other occasions. There were photographers on motorcycles, in cars, on foot. It was the apparatus the image market had deployed to get what was worth more than any other photograph of that year. From the moment the Mercedes left the Ritz to the impact against the 13th pillar, approximately 3 minutes elapsed. Investigations reconstructed those 3 minutes with the detail permitted by witness testimonies, traffic camera footage in the vicinity, and subsequent forensic analysis. The car was recognized immediately, and the vehicles with photographers followed. Henri Paul accelerated. The route through the nocturnal avenues of Paris was at increasing speeds. When they reached the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, Henri Paul was traveling at between 118 and 155 kilometers per hour in a 50-kilometer zone. The car struck something, possibly a slower vehicle, veered and went straight into the pillar. One aspect of the accident that investigations examined carefully was the presence of a white Fiat Uno that several witnesses said they had seen in the tunnel that night. Investigations searched for that vehicle for years. French police identified a photographer named James Anderson as a possible driver of the Fiat, but Anderson was able to demonstrate documentally that he was at his home in Lignières, more than 280 kilometers from Paris, when the accident occurred. Anderson died in May 2000, in circumstances that the official verdict described as suicide, which fed the conspiracy narrative. Investigations found no evidence that the Fiat was part of any coordinated plan. The scene in the tunnel, in the minutes immediately following the impact, was chaotic, and according to testimony gathered in the investigations, was photographed by several of the paparazzi who had followed the car. 3 of those photographers were tried for invasion of privacy, for having taken photographs through the open door of the vehicle while the victims were unconscious. They were acquitted in 2003. The debate over the moral responsibility of the paparazzi who pursued Diana and Dodi that night, which is a different debate from the legal one, has never been completely resolved and probably never will be, because it is the debate about the limits of an industry that literally lived off the pursuit of famous people. Trevor Rees-Jones, the only survivor of that night, published his memoirs years later. He remembered little of the moments before the impact, and nothing of the impact itself. He lived with the burden of being the only one who had survived, and with questions he could never fully answer, because his memory of those final minutes simply was not there. The 13th pillar of the Pont de l'Alma tunnel has today a drawing of Diana's face painted by her fans. The Flame of Liberty monument, which stands a few meters from the tunnel, and which was originally a 1987 gift from the American people to France, became the unofficial Diana memorial from the moment she died, covered with flowers, photographs and messages that arrive to this day from admirers of every generation and nationality. The story most often told about the night of August 31st, 1997, is Diana's story. It was before it happened, and it remains so. Dodi Fayed is in most versions the companion, the context, the man who was with her. This script cannot change that asymmetry because it is real. Diana was more famous, more beloved, more documented. But Dodi had his own story before meeting her, and he had the right to be something more than the name that appears after Diana's in headlines about the accident. He was the son of a father who loved him with an intensity that the pain of his death fully revealed. He was the producer who had won an Oscar. He was the man who in the final weeks of his life had found something that seemed to make him happy in a way different from everything before. And he was, at 12 hours and 17 minutes on August 31st, 1997, one of 4 people in a car going too fast in a Paris tunnel. The Repossi jeweler, Alberto Repossi, used a word to describe the ring that Diana had pointed to in the window of his Monaco boutique, the word that remains as the most condensed symbol of everything that happened that summer. Dis-moi oui, say yes to me. Whether Dodi ever spoke the words the ring anticipated is not known. Whether Diana would have said yes, or not yet, or never, is not known. Those words, if they were spoken in the imperial suite of the Ritz, in the hours before midnight on August 30th, 1997, and the only people who can confirm them are dead. What is known is that the car left the Ritz, that it entered the tunnel, and that the ring found among the wreckage was sent by Mohamed Al-Fayed to the urn in the Harrods monument, where it remains today, the object that summarizes in the smallest and most irreversible way everything that night took away. If this story has reached you, if at any moment you found yourself wondering who the man with Diana that night really was, and what life he had before the world knew him through his death, leave your thoughts in the comments. Did you know Dodi's story beyond the accident? Does it change anything about how you see that night in 1997? The debate is open, and if you want to know more about the stories surrounding the night at the Pont de l'Alma and about Diana's life before that summer of 1997, this channel has more chapters of this story. Subscribe